There is a number I want you to sit with for a second before I explain anything else. Two prices exist for oil right now, at the exact same moment, on the exact same planet. One of them is what you see on the news. The other one is what an actual refinery has to pay if it wants an actual barrel of oil delivered to its actual dock this week. And the gap between those two numbers right now is the widest it's been since the 2008 financial crisis. A trader named George Noble put it better than I could. He posted this a few months back. Paper oil settled at $90 on Friday. Physical oil traded at $144 2 weeks earlier. One of them is wrong. One of them is wrong. Let that sit for a second, because that sentence is the entire story of why your gas bill doesn't make sense right now, why the government's own forecast just got blown up in real time, and why I think what you're paying at the pump today is the cheapest this is going to get for a while. So let's actually get into it, because there's a lot happening this week, and almost none of it is being explained the way it deserves to be. Here's where things stand as of right now. The United States just wrapped its 10th consecutive night of airstrikes on Iran. 10 nights. In a row. 3 American service members were killed this past weekend alone, 2 in Jordan, 1 in Iran during what the military is calling a controlled drone detonation. The Pentagon says nearly 100 U.S. troops have been injured in just the last 2 weeks. Iran has been hitting back too, striking American-linked targets in Jordan, Bahrain, and Kuwait. And on Monday, Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed 2 oil tankers caught fire inside the Strait of Hormuz, blaming the U.S. for forcing them onto what they called an unsafe route. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know exactly who's telling the truth in the middle of a shooting war. Nobody watching this does either, and if someone online tells you they have it all figured out, I'd be a little suspicious of that confidence. But here's what isn't up for debate. Shipping data from Lloyd's List shows only 53 vessels crossed the Strait of Hormuz in the week ending July 20th. The week before that, it was 157. That's a 66% collapse in 7 days. And if you isolate just the tankers, the ships actually hauling oil and gas, crossings fell from 90 a week down to 30. 90 down to 30. In a single week. That's not a slowdown. That's an artery closing. And this is exactly the moment where I need you to remember the number I opened with, because this is where it connects. When a choke point like Hormuz gets this tight, 2 different oil markets start telling 2 different stories. There's the paper price. That's Brent and WTI futures, the number that scrolls across every news ticker in the world. And then there's the physical price, what a refinery in Asia or Europe actually has to pay this week to get a real tanker of real crude delivered to a real dock. For almost 20 years, those 2 prices move together, usually within $1 or 2 of each other. Since this war escalated, that gap has blown out to $30, $40, even $50 a barrel at its worst point. Dated Brent, the physical benchmark, hit an all-time record above $140 a barrel back in April. Meanwhile, the futures contract everyone quotes on TV was sitting nearly $40 cheaper. So why does a suit on a trading floor get to pretend oil is $40 cheaper than what it actually costs to buy? Because paper contracts are built on a bet that this all resolves quickly, that a ceasefire holds, that Hormuz reopens before the contract expires. The people trading paper oil are betting on diplomacy. The people who actually need barrels delivered to an actual port next Tuesday don't have the luxury of betting on anything. They're paying whatever it costs to keep the lights on. And history has a pretty blunt way of settling arguments like this. When paper and physical disagree for long enough, paper eventually has to catch up to reality, not the other way around. Physical barrels are real, paper contracts are a promise, and promises, eventually, come due. Which brings me to why the government's own forecast just embarrassed itself. 3 weeks ago, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the actual federal agency whose entire job is forecasting this stuff, published an official outlook saying gas would fall to $3.80 a gallon this quarter. That forecast was built on one load-bearing assumption, that the ceasefire signed with Iran back in June was going to hold. It didn't. It collapsed in early July, and right along with it, that entire forecast turned into wallpaper. On Monday, the national average hit $4 flat, not $3.80, $4. This isn't a story about analysts who did bad math. It's a story about a prediction that assumed peace in a war that hasn't actually ended. Before this war started on February 28th, gas in America averaged $2.98 a gallon. We're now at $4 for the second time this year. It spiked past $4.50 in May, came down when the June truce looked real, and now it's climbing right back because that truce is dead. But honestly, gas isn't even the number that worries me the most. Diesel is. Diesel hit $5.04 a gallon this week. A month ago, it was $3.65. You and I don't fill up with diesel most of the time, but diesel is the fuel that moves literally everything else in your life. The trucks bringing groceries to your store, the trains and the tractors growing your food in the first place. When diesel jumps 40% in 30 days, that cost doesn't evaporate. It travels down the supply chain and shows up somewhere you weren't even looking. I want you to meet a guy named Lee Davis. He farms cotton in Taylor County, Georgia. Not a hedge fund manager, not an oil trader, just a guy running equipment on diesel. His fuel costs alone went from $3.56 a gallon last year to over $5 now, which he says is adding about $1,800 a week in extra costs just to keep his operation running. $1,800 a week. And he's one of the luckier ones. Some farmers out in California are paying $7.40 a gallon for diesel right now. According to the American Farm Bureau Federation, 70% of farmers say they cannot afford all the fertilizer they need this season. Not choosing to cut back to save a little money cannot afford it. And fertilizer is made mostly from natural gas, which flows through the exact same strait that currently has tankers on fire in it. This isn't two separate crises. It's one crisis wearing two different outfits. And it's not just farmers 1,800 miles away in Georgia. I want you to meet Liz Smith. She's a mother of 4 from Colorado, and back around the 4th of July, she was driving home from a road trip to Maine in her Chevrolet Suburban. She told a reporter she actually considered not making the trip at all because filling up that Suburban was costing her over $100 a tank. Not $100 for a month of driving, $100 for one fill-up. Economists at Stanford's Institute for Economic Policy Research ran the math on families like hers, and they estimate this war will cost the average American household an extra $857 this year in gasoline alone. For a middle-class family pulling in $60,000 to $80,000 a year, that's somewhere between $100 and $200 extra dollars a month, every month, just evaporating at the pump. And that money used to do something. It used to be part of a car payment, or a week of groceries, or something going into savings. Now it just goes into the tank, and whatever it used to cover has to get squeezed from somewhere else. Here's the part that should actually worry you, whether you've ever met a farmer or not. A Cornell economist named Chris Barrett said something that I think is the single most important line in this entire story. The fertilizer shock hasn't even reached grocery shelves yet. His exact words were that the effects will materialize starting in late summer and build over the course of the fall and winter. Translation: what you're paying at the pump this week is not the bill. It's the deposit. The rest of the invoice shows up around Thanksgiving. The USDA has already nearly doubled its food inflation forecast for this year to about 3.1%, and that's the polite version. Rabobank, one of the larger agricultural banks, is projecting food inflation could hit 4 to 6% by December. For context, that would be the worst run since 2022, when groceries rose in the double digits for 9 straight months. Tomatoes are already up 32% year over year. Fruits and vegetables broadly, up around 6%. And by most expert estimates, we're still in the opening innings. Now let's zoom all the way out, because this is where I think the real story is hiding. Right now, in July 2026, the stock market is sitting near all-time highs. Wall Street looks completely fine. Meanwhile, gas is back at $4, diesel's at $5, and a cotton farmer in Georgia is eating $1,800 extra a week just to keep his tractor running. How do both of those realities exist on the same planet at the same time? Here's an angle almost nobody is talking about, and it genuinely surprised me when I found it. Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, not exactly a guy who panics for headlines, ran the numbers on how big this Hormuz disruption actually is compared to history. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo took about 4.5 million barrels a day off the market. That single event triggered a stock market crash of over 40%, a recession, inflation that hit double digits, and this is the part that should make you sit up. It took the Dow 20 years, adjusted for inflation, to fully recover. 20 years. Krugman's math says the current Hormuz shortfall is running somewhere around 20 million barrels a day at its worst points. That's roughly 5 times larger than 1973. Now, to be fair to Krugman and to you, the world uses oil far more efficiently today than it did in the 70s, so a direct one-to-one comparison isn't perfectly fair. But even accounting for that, if the disruption we're looking at right now is proportionally similar in scale to the shock that took 2 decades to fully unwind, then the fact that the S&P 500 is sitting near record highs isn't reassuring. It's strange. It's a market that is pricing in a story that hasn't caught up with the physical world yet. The exact same disconnect we just talked about with paper oil versus physical oil, just playing out on a bigger stage. In 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, oil went from $17 a barrel to $36 in about 3 months. Stocks fell, the economy dipped into recession, but because that shock only lasted about 9 months before Kuwait's oil came back online, the damage was contained. Sharp, but short. The 2026 Hormuz crisis is now in its 5th month, with no resolution in sight and a ceasefire that already broke once. If this were a boxing match, 1990 was a hard jab. What we're looking at right now is starting to look like it's going the distance. I want to be fair here because I try to always show you the other side of the argument, not just the scary one. The US government's official forecast, yes, the same one that just got embarrassed, still projects Brent crude will average around $74 a barrel by the 3rd quarter, and that gas prices ease back down as shipping slowly resumes. Reuters has reported that mediators floated a possible 10-day pause to try to resurrect the broken ceasefire. It's entirely possible a deal gets announced next week, and half of what I just told you becomes outdated by the time you finish this video. Wars end. Ceasefires happen. I'm not claiming I can outpredict the State Department, but here's why I'm not just taking the calm forecast at face value. We already ran this exact experiment once. There was a ceasefire in June. Everyone exhaled. Gas came down. And then it fell apart in about 3 weeks. And here we are. Except diesel is now even higher than it was the first time this happened. If a truce has already fooled you once, betting your household budget on the next one holding without question isn't exactly a high-confidence strategy. So let's talk about who's actually feeling this first, because it isn't us. Not yet. Asia got hit earliest and hardest. Deliveries there basically stopped back in April, and the Philippines was one of the first countries in the world to declare a national fuel emergency. Indonesia and Vietnam told workers to stay home to conserve gas. Thailand's fishing industry, which makes up around 1% of their entire economy, has been shutting down because marine fuel costs jumped 250%. Meanwhile, in the United States, we've historically been last in line for this kind of shock because of our own production and reserves. But last in line does not mean not in line. It just means our invoice arrives a little later than everyone else's. And given what's happening to diesel and fertilizer right now, that invoice looks like it's already in the mail. And it's not just us. Europe has been quietly absorbing its own version of this. Diesel and shipping costs there have climbed right alongside ours, and because so much of Europe's food and goods move by truck and rail from ports that depend on the same global oil market we do, several countries have started warning their own populations to brace for a rough winter of energy bills. This is the part I think gets lost when everyone stays focused on the number at the American pump. This isn't a local story happening to us. It's a global supply chain getting squeezed at its narrowest point, and different countries are just feeling that squeeze on different days, depending on how close their ports sit to the Gulf. There's one more piece of this that ties everything together, and it's the one that could turn expensive gas into something that touches every single loan you have, whether or not you own a car. When energy prices rise this fast, they drag overall inflation up with them, and the Federal Reserve's entire job is keeping inflation under control. For most of this year, markets expected the Fed to keep cutting interest rates. But with inflation numbers creeping back up because of exactly what we've been talking about, Some Fed officials have started openly discussing the opposite move, a rate hike instead of a cut. And if that happens, it's not just gas that gets more expensive. Your mortgage rate, your car loan, your credit card interest, all of it is priced off the same signal. So this isn't really a story about a gas pump anymore. It's a story about oil prices reaching into the rest of your financial life through the back door. Now, here's where the politics comes in. And I promise this isn't about picking a side. The numbers here are honestly wild no matter who you voted for. Trump's approval rating on the economy has been sitting somewhere between 29 and 37%, depending on the poll. Some of those numbers are worse than Joe Biden's lowest economic approval ratings from the exact same pollsters using the exact same methodology. 81% of Americans, including 79% of Republicans, say gas prices are straining their household budget right now. Not somewhat affecting, straining. That's not a partisan talking point anymore. That's just what people are feeling in their driveways and kitchens, red states and blue states alike. And then there's the quote I genuinely cannot get over. Back in May, when gas was sitting above $4.50, a reporter asked Trump about it directly, and he said, quote, "This is peanuts. I appreciate everybody putting up with it for a little while." Peanuts. I don't know which grocery store the president is shopping at, but I would love an invitation, because mine does not sell peanuts at these prices. Look, every president in modern history has downplayed bad economic news. That's not new, and I'm not going to pretend it is. But telling a farmer eating $1,800 extra a week, or a family staring at their grocery receipt in disbelief that their pain is peanuts, tends not to land the way you'd hope. The polling backs that up pretty clearly. This is a man who campaigned on getting gas under $2 a gallon within his first year in office. We're sitting at double that number now, heading into a November midterm where multiple polls show inflation and cost of living are the single biggest issue for voters, ahead of immigration, ahead of foreign policy, ahead of basically everything else on the ballot. So here's how I'd actually put all of this together, because I don't think this is complicated once you see the pattern. The paper price of oil says everything's fine. The physical price says it isn't. The government's forecast said gas would drop. Reality said it wouldn't. The stock market says calm down. A Nobel laureate's own math says this disruption is 5 times the size of the shock that took 20 years to recover from. Every single one of those pairs is the same story, just wearing a different costume. A comfortable story sitting right next to an uncomfortable number, and one of them is going to have to give. My honest read, and I want to be careful here because nobody has a crystal ball, is that the next month or two matters more than people realize. If Hormuz traffic stays choked at 30 tanker crossings a week instead of 90, the physical shortage keeps compounding the same way it did back in April, when Asia went critical before the US felt a thing. And on the food side, I think the sharpest pain hasn't even reached your grocery cart yet. Not because the experts are wrong, but because supply chains are slow by design. A fertilizer shortage in July doesn't show up as a higher price tag in July. It shows up once that crop gets harvested, shipped, processed, and stocked on a shelf, which, if Cornell's timeline is right, lands somewhere between now and the holidays. If I had to boil this whole thing down to one sentence, it's this. The price on the gas station sign is the headline, but it was never actually the whole story. It's just the fastest moving piece of a much bigger, much slower wave that's still working its way through everything else you buy. Because at the end of the day, nearly everything in your life arrived on a truck that burned diesel to get there. I'm not telling you to panic. Panicking has never once made anyone's grocery bill smaller. But I am telling you to pay close attention over the next couple of months, because if the pattern from earlier this year repeats itself, diesel spiking first, food catching up a few months later, then the number frustrating you at the pump today might genuinely end up being the easy part of this story. Thank you so much for watching. If this helped connect some dots for you, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.